Fascinating details, though, coming out. So joining us now, member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Good to have you on this morning.
Good morning, Mika.
So George Conway has a piece in the Washington Post, and he writes a lot about the Mueller Report, but the part that really stands out is how stunned he is that the report is quoted as saying it does not exonerate him. He says it's a stunning thing for a prosecutor to say. Do you think that is as well? And the president says he's completely exonerated by the report. What's your response?
Well, I guess I have two responses to that. Number one, you know, the dead-end defenders of the president, I think, are getting it wrong. And by the way, some of the people who are disappointed with this report are also getting it wrong. But the dead-end defenders who are doing things like going after Adam Schiff, saying there was never any evidence of a possible collusion, they're just plain wrong. There was lots of evidence of a possible collusion, right? And it just didn't rise to the level of an indictable offense. With respect to the obstruction, here's my theory. As we know, it is the Department of Justice policy that the president cannot be indicted. So there is no amount of evidence, no fact pattern that would cause the Department of Justice to indict the president for obstruction of justice. Now, we've all seen the evidence of possible, and I possible there, obstruction. And so what I think is happening here is that Bob Mueller, who understands the inner workings of Washington and the DOJ probably as well as anybody, he is sending a signal that Congress, which of course is the sole body that can hold the president accountable, needs to make the decision about whether there was obstruction, which is of course why it's important that we get the full report.
Well, we have to get the full report. Yuval Levin in the National Review had a great column yesterday where he talked about, he called it the Barr letter interlude. And Yuval said this: when we look back upon this sordid story, we won't remember the conclusion as defined by Barr's letter, but by Mueller's report. And we have yet to see what the report says, so we don't actually know exactly what that definition will consist of, which, again, it's fairly remarkable how, from the start, you did have both sides jumping to conclusions when, in fact, we still don't know what the report says. How do you get the report so we can put this behind us and start focusing much more on health care and wages and, getting people back to work?
Yeah, look, we're going to get the report, Joe. You know, there was a unanimous vote in the House to release the report. Most senators agree that the report should be released, except for apparently Lindsey Graham. The president says release the report. So we're going to get the report, even if it requires a subpoena. I am sort of curious about why it is that the report hasn't been released. I understand classified information. That can be dealt with quickly. Look, if this report made the president of the United States look good, we would have had it 3 milliseconds after it arrived at the Department of Justice. So I'm very curious about that. We are going to get the report. But again, people need to manage their expectations. The people who are defending the president at all costs, you know, there is no way you come out of being cleared of treason looking good. There is no way you get out of not being impeached for obstruction of justice, which, if Nancy Pelosi's policy is to be believed, is where we end up looking good. On the other hand, again, those mostly on my side of the aisle who are disappointed that the president wasn't colluding with a hostile foreign power. Folks, step back. The fact that our president was not criminally conspiring with a hostile foreign power is cause for celebration, not cause for political disappointment.
So, Congressman, I want to ask you about something you said earlier. So in the Barr letter, he specifically writes, I believe, that the question of whether the president can be prosecuted was not central to his determination that there was no obstruction. And so I'm asking you, like, is it possible that he's making that up, that he's averring something, that something else is going on there, that in fact the policy and the view that the president can't be criminally prosecuted was in fact part of his consideration?
Without the facts, it's hard to know whether that conclusion is right or not. What we do know is two things. Number one, The Attorney General, with all due respect, got his job partly because he wrote a 19-page memo to the Department of Justice saying you can't investigate, not charge, you can't investigate the president for obstruction of justice. And number two, setting that aside, and that's just a possible indication of bias on the part of the Attorney General, it's not his call to make. Two previous presidents, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, were threatened with impeachment or actually impeached for obstruction of justice. So what the decision he's making is arrogating the authority of Congress to make that decision, which is yet another reason why that report needs to be made in its entirety available to us.
Michael Steele.
Congressman, let's that point, because I think it says a lot about where the Democrats go next, potentially. How much of this do you think is actually resonating with the American people right now, to the extent that we've just spent the last few minutes or so getting a little bit weedy about this subject matter? Do you think that this is something that American people have been paying that close attention to, that all they see right now is the president going, hey, no collusion, as I said, I'm exonerated, even though the report didn't say that. They don't know that necessarily. How do you think the American people are reading this, and what does that mean for Democrats politically going into 2020, let alone the rest of this year?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question, and to me, it's sort of the central question. And to me, what I mean by that is I'm in the camp of those who believe that this president gets held accountable not via impeachment or indictment, but gets held accountable in 2020 when the American people decide whether to renew his contract. But the answer to your question, Michael, I'm pretty convinced is that this scandal speaks intensely, and as I talked about earlier, probably inappropriately, to the relatively small, and I don't know if that number is 20, 30, or 40% of Americans who are absolutely dug in, pro or against this president. For them, this is absolute catnip. But for most Americans who are worried about how they're going to educate their kids, who are worried about, losing their health care, I think this is a little bit of a sideshow. And so to answer the other part of your question, I think if Democrats are smart, we're going to continue to do the oversight that we need to do of a president that desperately needs oversight. But we're going to remember that our chance to hold this guy accountable comes down to the extent to which we have told the American people prior to 2020's election that we care about their health care, that we care about their ability to retire, that we care about their ability to educate their kids. If we don't focus on that, our opportunity to hold this president accountable with the force of an American election will begin to erode, and that scares me a lot.
Congressman Jim Himes, thank you very much for being on this morning.